Thanks very much for joining our Monday Mind Share. Just wanted to share a little bit today on some interesting approaches to really ensure that you're in Zone 2 and you're reaping all the benefits from Zone 2 training, aerobic training, and we know that means fat oxidation training. So let's jump into it. I'm going to share some content here and walk you through some of the data originally from my own training sessions, and then get into some of the concepts of ensuring we're in Zone 2. Okay, so maybe if I can just start, this is a 30-kilometer run, carb fasted. So no carbohydrate, purely SFuels train, which is, for those not familiar, MCT-based fat and some electrolytes, and have that in water through this 30-kilometer period. Now, on the left-hand side, it's just got the map of this, and it because it's a loop course starting here in the lower left in the red dot, and it's all colorful, different colors up to the 7-kilometer point, but really that's being overshadowed from what happened on the way back on the loop course. But basically, this was quite slow all the way out, all the way to the turnaround, coming all the way back up till this last 7 kilometers to go. In other words, the first 23 kilometers were slow. And then if you look at this legend down the bottom here, you start getting into the green, yellows, oranges, and reds, which is what you're seeing this last 7 kilometers of the run. And you see that here in my heart rate over on the right, top right, whereby at that point, heart rate increased, and you can see down below that for that period of time, that 40 minutes, that the pace also dramatically increased. So the reason I bring this out, I'm going to come back to this, is that how could you, after 3 hours running at a certain pace, be able to dramatically increase your pace for another 7 kilometers for 40 minutes? And the only way to explain that is that this whole period here was largely burning fat, and I had plenty of glycogen still remaining for that final 40 minutes, or in this case, 7 kilometers. So, and there was a reason for this, the way this happened. I was actually running with my son, and at this point, he effectively hit the wall, and I had to get back to the car and come and pick him up. So, clearly for him, at this pace that we were running, he was not in Zone 2, but he was running at a higher zone, and he was using up his carbohydrate much quicker. So let's jump into some data, and I think I've shared these charts before on the left, and really want to bring out here the impact of Zone 2 long, slow distance training and what it can do to our metabolic efficiency. And specifically, we'll get into how this works in a second. But on the left-hand side here, where this pink bar is, and at this point here, where this green dot, which is representing the percentage of all energy being contributed by carbohydrate. And at this pink line here is about where it crosses over is 80%. So almost 80% of all energy from the athlete was coming from carbohydrate at this point in time, 2019, and generating about 250 watts. You actually have to go way back to the left, right back until about just after 150 watts, where glucose rapidly becomes the predominant source. And it's at this point, of course, that, the utilization of glucose become the predominant source of energy. And because you are using that much more glucose, your lactate levels also begin to rise. Fast forward 2 years to the right-hand side, this pink line again, at about 80% of all energy at this point now is coming, and this is 300 watts, is coming now from fat. Only 20% of the energy is coming from glucose. And in fact, you have to go, you'll see there's a rapid rise then from 300 to 350 watts in the use of glucose, and we see the switch over here happen. And it's at this point, of course, that lactates would start to build fast. But you can see that this athlete can be mostly using fat, 80% of the time using fat, and obviously producing much lower levels of lactate that can easily be cleared. Now, what is happening? So in this training process here, the athlete was conducting a lot of, we would say, LSD, long, slow distance, fasted, carbohydrate fasted training sessions. And metabolically, what's actually happening, if you look at the muscle fibers responsible for supporting energy at that slow, long type of exercise, or zone 2 as we refer to it as, and we'll get into how to qualify exactly what that is in a second. But at that intensity, it's mostly the type 1 muscle fibers that are supporting that type of intensity. And by training at that intensity, that type 1 muscle fiber increases the density and the functionality of mitochondria, particularly the density. So what that means is that because I have more mitochondria, I can begin to increase the intensity, but still being able to do that in an aerobic manner, meaning burning fat, meaning less dependency on glucose, which also has a reduction in the amount of, therefore, lactate production. That said, even training at that zone 2 long, slow distance intensity, the type 1 muscle fibers increase a specific transporter referred to as MCT1, and that's responsible for taking lactate from type 2 fibers, and that lactate is shuttled from type 2 fibers through another transporter into the type 1 fibers using this MCT1 transporter. And as we do more training at that particular zone 2 intensity, we find that that MCT1 transporter increases, and thereby allowing that as you increase intensity, the lactate that's being produced is being able to be cleared and reused for energy in those type 1 muscle fibers. Not many realize that, but lactate itself is a key substrate for working muscles, but it is required for that MCT transporter to bring that lactate into the type 1 muscle fibers. And it's zone 2, long, slow distance training that does this. So, there's many mechanisms or methods to work out zone 2, and I'm sure you've heard of most of these. The left-hand side, by calculating 220 minus your age, and somewhere 70 to 80% of that number is that zone 2 range. There is the Phil Maffetone method, which is taking 180 minus your age. And then there's 3 or 4 caveats: overtraining, undertraining, injuries, no injuries, that can further influence that outcome, that number. And you can search that online looking for the MAF method. And then, more subjective is the use of the RPE scale. Somewhere 3 to 4 is generally recognized as you're probably in zone 2. It's a little hard to really quantify. On a bike, you can use your functional threshold power and multiply it by 55 to 75%. It was actually quite a large range. But in that range, it's proposed that you're most probably generally in zone 2. The one that is really simple and it is very easily applied, and it's quite interesting the way this works, is that as you're biking or running, and probably easy to do it, if you will, on your trainer inside your home or on your treadmill. But basically you start ramping the intensity, and you want to be able to carry out a full conversation. It might be slightly strained, but you still can carry out and continue a full conversation. And if you really want to test this, what's interesting is, put in your earbuds that have a microphone, with the earbuds, and start your voice recording, or maybe get up to those intensities first, of where you think the zone 2 is, or just before it. Start your voice recording and start having, even if you're just reading a magazine or something like that, and continue to read the material and slowly begin to increase the intensity. And you can go back later and listen to your voice, and you can even say in the voice, okay, I'm going from 110 beats a minute to 120 beats a minute. And then you're reading and you're seeing how your voice is. And then you go say, okay, I'm going now from 120 to 130 beats per minute. And you start reading again and see how your voice changes. And what is happening here is, of course, the requirement for the body to offload the carbon dioxide. It gets to a point where that requirement to do that begins interfering with your ability to speak. And that's what the talk test is. You can then also take a more quantified, I should say, test in a lactate test. Thought to be somewhere between 1.7 and 1.9 is a good reference for being in that zone 2 zone. And then, of course, probably the gold standard is that you go into a lab and they'll put you on a bike trainer or a treadmill, and then you can have your intensity ramp with the metabolic cart, and they're actually measuring through sensors in your breathing apparatus the carbon dioxide and oxygen ratios, and thereby calculating your substrates. They are calculating all your different zones. I would say with that VO2 mass test and even the lactate test, they are true and absolutely accurate, but at the point of time that the test actually happens. The interesting thing about the talking test is that as your fitness goes down or up, your ability, your zone 2 will shift with that, and the talk test will continue to be valid as you increase in fitness or you have a reduction in fitness. So I always find that really interesting, in that it continues to be real time and effectively on understanding where you are with your zone 2. And then we have this final case, which I want to talk about, which is really a field test of understanding, are you really in zone 2? And this is the real test in a sense. And I come back to the example I gave earlier of the 30-kilometer run. And the theory is that after so many hours, and 3 hours is good, and we can come back and talk about that if you like, but a long period of time exercising at a consistent aerobic pace, which is slow, it should be your zone 2 pace. By theory, having largely only burnt fat, being in that aerobic zone, that zone 2, for those first 3 hours, you should still have glycogen available in muscle and liver to support a higher pace, meaning zone 3 or 4, for a subsequent probably 40 minutes to an hour. Now, the reason it's 40 to 60 minutes is even though you're mostly burning fat in those first 3 hours, you're still definitely burning some glycogen. It's not binary, one or the other. Even when you get up into the high intensity spaces, you're still burning some fat. So how do you do this? Well, you calculate your zone 2 where you think it should be, the lower and the upper limits, using some of the examples I had on the prior slide. Choose the course either out on the road or maybe even better still on a bike trainer or a treadmill where you can maintain a consistent pace for 3 hours. And you should be avoiding, of course, any intake, consumption of carbohydrate, whether that's in the way of drinks or gels or bars or fuels of any type during those 3 hours, and only consume really water electrolytes or something like SFuels Train, where there's no carbohydrate essentially in the food or the drink. Then start your run or your bike at this pace and continue to sit inside of that lower and upper heart rate limit of your calculated zone 2 range, what you think it is, what you think it should be. And then at the 3 hour point, you should be able to then increase that pace to what your calculated zone 3 or 4 pace should be. And you should be able to do that for up to an hour. And you can do this and prove, if you will, that at a certain pace, that you are largely only burning fat, having the ability to increase performance for that last part of the session. And in a sense, this is really almost like a race simulation where your understanding and your confidence of what your body can actually do at a certain pace is correct, is accurate. Now, you can come back and retest this as your fitness changes and you think your zone 2 has elevated, and you can begin to test this again. And maybe your initial test, you were this particular test here you're seeing for myself, my average heart rate was on 118 in those first 3 hours, which is very close to the 220 minus my age 70% number. But if I looked at the math method, I probably had another 10 beats increase that I could have ran at in those first 3 hours. And based on that math and algorithm, I should still have been able to run the last 7 kilometers, 40 minutes at this higher pace. And that's really what you're testing here, is to really understand that upper limit of zone 2 so that come race day, you really understand where you're mostly burning fat and at what power on your bike, at what pace running, and having the confidence then, so that in the latter part of the race, you've proven in training that you've got plenty of glycogen to go burn and work with. So hopefully this is interesting, that you can apply this to further tune both your training and optimization of zone 2 to get that impact on fat oxidation efficiency, glycogen preservation, lactate clearance, and have the confidence going into races knowing that you've proved at what pace that you're mostly burning fat and at what pace then you can replicate coming into race day. I hope that's helpful. Wish you all the best in training and racing, and go on. Thanks. Bye.